By the mid-20th century, sodomy was an obsolete crime. It was still on the books in a few states, but it was old-fashioned and out of date with its biblical origins and history of hanging and burning at the stake. And it was difficult to prosecute. To prove sodomy, prosecutors had to prove penetration. But gay sex was still illegal, so prosecutors had ready at hand a battery of nuisance charges, such as loitering, vagrancy, disorderly conduct, and soliciting, for use against disfavored minorities, including gays. These charges often could be bargained down to misdemeanors with a guilty plea, and the arrest then could be settled with a fine. The real punishment was the public shaming. The laws were vague and very unequally applied. City Hall, the district attorney, the police, and the judges were all in cahoots. Any town at any time might decide to crack down. There were famous purges in Madison in 1945, Los Angeles in 1946, Chicago in 1949, and Boise in 1955. This would generally happen whenever a reform party took over City Hall with a tough-on-crime agenda. The old machine clubs were less puritanical. No statistics were kept on these low-level crimes. Such arrests typically got only local coverage, so the national scope and extent of the harassment campaign went unreported. I don't have numbers, but over the decades, these arrests and guilty pleas very likely amounted to tens of thousands. In this clip, we'll look at examples from some cases that did get reported in the news. This mugshot is the singer Johnny Ray. In 1953, he propositioned an undercover cop in the men's room of a burlesque theater in Detroit, and he was arrested for soliciting. He pleaded guilty, paid a fine, and was released. Not long afterwards, his songs Cry and Just Walkin' in the Rain were huge hits, and he starred with Elvis and Marilyn. The man on the right is Bayard Rustin, photographed here with Jawaharlal Nehru in Pasadena in 1953. Rustin, a Quaker pacifist who served 2 years in prison for draft resistance, was in Pasadena to give a lecture to a conference on world peace. A few hours after the lecture, Rustin was arrested with 2 other men for carrying on in a parked car. He was charged with vagrancy and lewd conduct, but pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of sex perversion. Even with the plea bargain, he served 60 days in jail. In 1962, the police in Mansfield, Ohio, conducted a sting operation in the men's room of a city park. They planted a camera inside a towel dispenser and made a film which the FBI distributed to local police departments to do the same. 38 men were arrested for sodomy and did jail time. William E. Jones used the original footage to make a movie with the title Tea Room. You can see it on YouTube. The city of Mansfield brought in a backhoe and buried the scene of the crime. In 1964, Life magazine published a photo essay by Bill Epridge showing a police decoy in Hollywood just standing around looking lonely. Proposition him and you will soon be wearing handcuffs like this man, being led away by the decoy on the right, the backup officer on the left. The perp was charged with soliciting and broke down in tears. Just before the election of 1964, Walter Jenkins, Lyndon Johnson's chief of staff, was arrested in a men's room at the YMCA on a charge of disorderly conduct. Jenkins was married. He and his wife had 6 children. This was Jenkins' second arrest in the same place for the same thing. In 1959, he paid a small fine, and the matter ended there. But this time there was a political angle. The newspapers were on the story, and he had to resign. Jenkins went back to Texas and worked as an accountant and business consultant. You may have noticed that several of these incidents took place in men's rooms, and that was not accidental. The sociologist Claude Humphreys, in 1970, published a study with the title Tea Room Trade. The book was so controversial that George Washington University tried to cancel Humphrey's doctoral degree. Humphrey said 38% of the men he studied identified as straight, 24% as bisexual, 24% as gay but closeted, only 14% as openly gay. Most of the men were married, Humphrey said, and went home to unsuspecting wives. This is the actor George Maharis and his Playgirl centerfold in July of 1973. Playgirl did not inform its readers that Maharis had recently been arrested on suspicion of lewd conduct. A Hollywood Vice Squad officer said Maharis had made a pass at him in the men's room of a drive-in restaurant. He was allowed to plead guilty to a charge of disturbing the peace and paid a $50 fine. That was in 1967. And then in 1974, just a year after the Playgirl feature, he was arrested in Los Angeles in what the Advocate called a campy LA restroom. It seems that gay men in the Palms neighborhood more or less adopted the men's room at a gas station, keeping it clean and even decorating it. Maharis and another man were charged with sex perversion, but were allowed to plead guilty to trespassing, a misdemeanor. Conveniently for Representative John Henson, a Mississippi Democrat, there was a men's room just a few doors from his office in the Longworth Congressional Office Building. But inconveniently, in 1981, the police set up a peephole in the ventilation shaft, and Henson was charged with sodomy, a felony. He was released on $2,000 bail. Harold Moore, a black man who worked for the Library of Congress, was arrested with Henson. Moore spent the night in jail. Henson's sodomy charge was reduced to the lesser charge of attempted sodomy, a misdemeanor, and the prosecutor accepted a plea of no contest. The judge gave him a 30-day suspended jail sentence, and Henson resigned from Congress. Henson was married. In later life, he divorced and became a gay rights activist and was a founder of the Lesbian and Gay Citizens Association of Fairfax County, Virginia. He died of AIDS in 1995 at the age of 53. Bob Uplinger's loitering case went through several trials in New York State and finally reached the U.S. Supreme Court. There now is a memorial plaque at the site where Uplinger loitered. Here's how it happened. The New York Court of Appeals had struck down the state sodomy statute in 1980, but the loitering law was still on the books. Then, early one August morning in 1981, while walking home in Buffalo's gay neighborhood, Bob Uplinger struck up a conversation with another young man and invited him to his home to have sex. The stranger was an undercover cop, and Uplinger was convicted of loitering to solicit and fined $100. He appealed, and the New York Court of Appeals dismissed the conviction, overturning the loitering law. Then the Erie County prosecutor appealed the dismissal to the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case, establishing the right of New Yorkers to loiter. Uplinger continued his activism and was a co-founder of Gay and Lesbian Youth of Buffalo. He died of AIDS in 1988. He was 37 years old. Senator Larry Craig was flying home to Idaho from Washington on July 11, 2007, and he had a layover at the Minneapolis airport. He stopped at a men's room and entered a stall. Police Sergeant Dave Karsnia was in the next stall. There was disagreement on exactly what happened, and if you are interested, you can find a YouTube clip reenacting the scene from police reports. In any case, in a short time, Senator Craig found himself arrested on suspicion of lewd conduct. He pled guilty to the lesser charge of disorderly conduct, a misdemeanor, and paid $575 in fines and fees. A few weeks later, he changed his mind and tried to take the guilty plea back, but the judge would not go along. The senator insisted it was all a mistake and declared that he was not gay. When his term expired, he did not run for re-election.